Well, esteemed colleagues, welcome to the Asian Evaluation Week, day 4. My name is Sven Harten. I'm Deputy Director of DEval, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you today's session on evidence and gap maps. Before I do so, I would just briefly tell you who is with us today, because we've got a panel of some very esteemed colleagues, experts in the field of evaluation. So I'm really glad to have with me here Magdalena Orth, who is a senior evaluator and team leader at DEval, which is the German Evaluation Institute for Development Cooperation. She is working on issues of development finance, financial cooperation, and is recently completed a big evaluation on blended finance. Next up in the line is our esteemed colleague Andreas Reumann. He's a principal evaluation officer at the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund based in South Korea. He's got extensive experience in designing impact monitoring systems for large research for development projects. He worked, for instance, also at the Center for International Forestry Research, C4, and has degrees from Germany, Nanyang Technical University in Singapore, as well as Copenhagen. And then last but not least, my very esteemed colleague, Milena Reinfeld. She's a senior evaluator at the European Investment Bank Evaluation Division based in Luxembourg. And before joining EIB, she worked 18 years for DEval in the UK, in several countries, including Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sudan, Pakistan, and she has lots of experience also with the European Commission and a long career as all the colleagues here on board in evaluation. So I'm really glad to have them on board. And before we start, just a key takeaway for you. Many of you are designing and implementing, managing evaluations, and evidence and gap maps is what we're going to talk today about. And those are a great tool to understand where do you have gaps, where do you have evidence, and to design your evaluation strategy. So to focus, to know where to focus on or where not to, and to know where some are needed, where you can do some systematic reviews, or where you have actually gaps. So it's not so much about knowing what works and what doesn't. For that, you have got other tools. This is a tool to know where you have evidence and where you don't. And as you see, I mean, here today we're speaking from Germany's Evaluation Institute. We've got the EIB on board, and we've got the Green Climate Fund. So 3 diverse players, and we're all using them. So that sort of means that for a very broad range of evaluation professionals, this is an interesting tool. So let's get started with my slides. I'm going to start off with some sort of objectives, concept, methods of evidence and gap maps, and then you'll get some really exciting examples from my 3 colleagues who use that, and we're going to show you how that looks in practice. So next slide, please. So I'm gonna just tell you a bit about what those evidence and gap maps are for strange animals, so that you understand a bit more what it is. Show you different examples because they can look really, really different, and show you how our example looks like. Talk a bit about limitations, and then some reflections and recommendations as evaluator. Okay. So next slide, please. So what are they? Well, it's in the name, right? It's a map. So it's a visual overview of where you have evidence and where you don't have. It shows impact evaluations in a sector, schematically representing types of evaluations and outcomes. So it's a user-friendly format to show across different interventions and outcomes, whether you have primary studies. Usually you start with some minimum quality criteria, so you include quasi-experimental studies, systematic reviews, and then you show in which sectors you have them and where you don't. So next slide, please. So in a nutshell, you know, in our world as evaluators, evidence is often scattered around different websites, different organizations, gray literature, you have different databases. And when you start thinking about, okay, we want to do some evaluations, for instance, in the energy sector or on climate change or on SMEs, well, how do you know where to start? And evidence and gap maps are a great way to start deciding on where you want to focus your evaluation activities, because they show for which measures, actions, and interventions there is evidence, and where you may want to do some evaluations. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide and some others next on are courtesy of Howard White, from formerly from 3IE. Basically, he's talking about that you have an evidence synthesis product space. So many of you might be thinking, okay, I heard about synthesizing evidence, so what does that mean for evidence and gap maps? And where do they stand? So first of all, the first way to start often is with, or what some people try to do is they look at different primary studies and they bring them together. So the most systematic way is called a systematic review. They focus on primary studies and they actually also show the information that you get in those studies. So they present the results. Then next along the line are sort of studies that group systematic reviews together. And then next is what we're going to talk today about, evidence and gap maps. They look at systematic reviews and primary studies. And then you also have methods that just group different evidence gap maps together to show sort of a map of maps. By the way, I forgot to mention in the beginning, if you have questions, please add them in the Q&A section. We have great moderators here on board who will help us to look at those questions. So along the way, please add your questions in the Q&A chat box. Okay, because even though this is virtual, we want to make this interactive. Okay, next slide, please. So basically, this is sort of the same information again. However, here my key point is one limitation, or one thing that you need to know about evidence and gap maps is they don't show you actually what the evidence says. They only show you where you have evidence and where you don't. So it's sort of the first product in that line where you don't have that information. Only the previous ones, for instance, systematic reviews, they show you what the evidence says. So an evidence and gap map is a tool for deciding on evaluation or research policies. It's not so much a tool for operational decision makers. Okay, next slide, please. So now it gets fun. You're going to see some different examples. Next slide. I think at least I've seen 10 different types roughly, but just wanted to show you some. So one is a way where they show you the methodological quality of the reviews that you see here in the red, yellow, and green boxes, and also the strength of the evidence. But they don't really show you how much studies there were or what sort of types of studies. But it's one way of looking at this. And next one, please. This is probably my favorite because it's so complicated. But in a way, it's quite cool. It's about policing in the UK. Also, a slide I got from Howard White. Here you have lots of information about the type of intervention, so the scope of the the target of the intervention, some level of proactivity, which is another information on the intervention, and on the y-axis, sort of the specific mechanism, and then you have some way of trying to show the results. So basically, negative, positive evidence, depending on the different colors. So quite complex. Next one. Here, basically, what is quite nice here is that you see the size of the studies in the different sectors. So all those bubbles, the size of the bubbles is the size of the literature that they found, and in the different columns, you see confirming, disconfirming, or inconclusive evidence. Next one, please. However, we are sort of convinced that there's a very useful way of going about this, which we all used. Next slide, please. This is basically a version that has been developed by 3IE, and that we used. So here you actually see on the y-axis the information about the sectors or areas of intervention. So this is from climate change and climate change adaptation. Andreas will talk more about this. So you'll see the interventions were, for instance, in the water or forestry sectors. Then you have another column on the y-axis which show the intervention types or subsectors. So this could be financial cooperation or infrastructure or technology. And then on the x-axis on top, you see what those interventions try to achieve, so the outcome areas. So are they trying to support the enabling environment, or are they trying to promote, improve adaptive capacities through skills and awareness? So here you got lots of information about the interventions as such. Next slide, please. And then once you populate those, basically the colors of the bubbles, they show you what type of research we found. So is it primary research? Are those quasi-experimental studies or experimental systematic reviews? So you get some information on the type of research. Also the number of studies according to how large the bubbles are, and also you see where the gaps are. So we'll get more information about this as we go along through the presentations by my colleagues. Next slides. So some limitations. So I already said you don't get what sort of the evidence actually is. Also, another important thing to mention is that when you start, you decide a minimum standard of quality of evidence that go in. So which studies you're actually gonna include in your evidence and gap map. So usually it's some form of counterfactual, it's needed. You do quasi-experimental studies or experimental, but you could be more lenient as well. In any case, in the 3IE version, you do not rate the quality. So there's just a minimum cutoff. It's also not a meta-analysis, right? So there's no aggregate results analysis of the results. However, it's a great starting point. So if you have done an evidence and gap map, lots of your initial work for meta-analysis is already done. And of course, you need to focus on sort of the coder's abilities. So in some teams, language might be an issue. Unfortunately, most of our evidence and gap maps, they focus more on English, French, Spanish. There's as far as I know, not so much in the Arabic space, for instance. So which language you're considering. Next slide. So just some reflections, having seen a couple of those studies. Very important is to get everybody on board what this map is. Time and time again, people get sort of a bit disappointed because they hope to see get insights from what the evidence actually says. As I said a couple of times, you don't get that from an evidence gap map. It's just a starting point for this. Secondly, as in so many research projects, getting the framework right is critical. So how do you classify your interventions? How do you classify the types of outcomes? This is the framework of the map, and this determines how big your boxes are. You have to consult your stakeholders, look at existing classifications to get it right. This is really, really key. And then once you have that, test again. It is a bit cumbersome to fill this, but yeah, you'll have to just go through this. What is also important, and with that I almost stop, is that once you have a map, you know, if you're working in organizations, you might want to plan for maintenance, so that it's not just a study in the shelf, but that you maintain it and that you update it like every 2 years or so. Because updating is just a little additional effort, and it's really worthwhile once you have done the big work. Okay, so with that, my initial thoughts are, those were my initial thoughts, and now I'm happy to pass through Magdalena to show you a bit more how that looks in practice.
Thank you very much, Sven. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Bonn, Germany. I'm delighted to be able to present you the first example of this panel. And this first example is an evidence gap map on blended finance interventions that was part of an evaluation, or first step of an evaluation that we recently conducted. Maybe for those of you not working in the blended finance space, so what actually is blended finance? Blended finance is used to mobilize private capital to finance sustainable development in developing countries. And we see in the recent years quite some increase in the interest in blended finance, and also connected to it, discussed potential to cover actually the financing gap being in place to finance the sustainable development goals. But at the same time, we see for blended finance intervention that we have very little evidence on the actual impact, and therefore thought it's necessary to actually see where the gaps in evidence are, and then to inform future research and evaluation, of course, on where are the most pressing needs in the field of blended finance to address these evidence gaps. So next slide, please. So as Sven mentioned just in his presentation, also for us, the most important first step was to define the concept, and specific for the blended finance space is that we're talking about quite a field in developing evaluation methods and developing the field of evaluation. So here, first of all, we designed a theory of change to decide what effects do we cover in the evidence gap map. And as you can see on the left-hand side regarding the inputs, we covered 8 different blended finance instruments that follow the categorization and definition of a blended finance task force that offers internationally recognized categorization on these things. And as you can see in the graph, we focused mainly on 2 effects of blended finance that are depicted in different colors here below, which is first of all financial additionality as very important point here, as it justifies why to use blended finance, and then of course development additionality, so to see in terms of outcomes and impacts what is blended finance really achieving. So next slide, please. Regarding method, I do not want to go into too much detail because Sven just offered an excellent explanation of the different steps for an evidence gap map, but maybe to highlight as well here a specific aspect for the area of blended finance. So we could have gone about the evidence gap map in just including quantitative studies, following rigorous quantitative evaluation methods, experimental experimental or quasi-experimental designs. But as we're talking about a rather recent field for development evaluation, we thought it makes much more sense to broaden the inclusion criteria to find more studies, because we already expected that the number of studies would be low. And this showed to be a very good decision to also include gray literature and qualitative studies here. We then made sure to show in the evidence gap map, and this is what you will see later on, we decided then to show what we have in terms of evidence and what is the basis in terms of methodology, so that you know for the evidence from what kind of rigorous methods this is actually coming from. So the selection is based on what you already learned also in the last presentation, the PICOS system that is used for the evidence gap map. So defining the inclusion and exclusion criteria for subject or population, intervention, comparisons, effects, and then as well the study design, where I already mentioned that we decided to also include qualitative studies. So next slide, please. Yes, in terms of result of this evidence gap map, first of all, you can see that this evidence gap map once again lists the different blended finance instruments here. And then we have effects in 4 categories, which is then, as mentioned, financial additionality, development additionality, market development, and sector details. And overall, you see that even though we included the qualitative studies and even though we used more lenient inclusion criteria, we actually have quite a low number of evidence. So in the end, we had with a more rigorous evaluation, either quantitatively or qualitatively, we had 26 included reports, and in those reports, 73 pieces of evidence that we included. And as you can see, most of the evidence was coming from results-based financing as one instrument of blended finance, followed by grants, in case they use blended finance, and followed by guarantees. So this to show you a little bit of what this evidence showed as a result. And then I will come to some lessons to close the presentation. So next slide, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the beginning, for us it was very important to see that we have blended finance as an area where we have quite some discussion, where we have quite some potential being discussed about this type of financing, but this is really in contrast with the lack of evidence that we have in blended finance interventions. And reasons are manifold. So for example, reasons could be that, of course, there is an inherent complexity in blended finance interventions, most of them often using financial intermediary structure before on lending to end beneficiaries. We have challenges regarding the assessment, of course, of additionality, and here, due to this, access to counterfactuals. But as mentioned, we also see that a lot in terms of evaluating blended finance is still in progress. So these are at least a few of the reasons that we thought about might be in place. But then what is really interesting, and then we went one step further to compare actually our evidence and our evidence gaps with the distribution of blended finance investments. And here, once again, we see a stark contrast between where we find the most evidence, but where most of the blended finance investments actually go to. So this means specifically that we found the most evidence on results-based financing, but looking in the funding structures, this makes only up for nearly 1% of investments in the blended finance space right now. And the other way around, we have a lot of concessional finance or first loss capital being employed in blended finance. And this, once again, is backed by very little evidence. So we see here a high importance of obtaining evidence for different fields of blended finance, which is most importantly, insurance, hedging, and junior and subordinated capital that should be addressed. And in terms of sectors, this is the sectors of environment and financial services that need to be addressed, where we find the lowest number of evidence. And coming to a last point for this presentation, we also see that we have a change in the blended finance space in terms of what the different investors actually ask for. So even private investors aim for better assessment of the impact of their investments. So here we see that additional evidence, first of all, is not only important to know about the impact of blended finance, but could also facilitate mobilization of private funding. Yes, with this, I want to close the presentation. Thank you, and very happy to answer any questions in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Magdalena. So next up is Andreas, and he'll show us an example of an evidence gap map in climate change adaptation. Andreas, over to you.
Thanks, Sven, and thanks, Magdalena. Really exciting work that I see here. Hello and a warm welcome to the presentation on the evidence gap map on climate change adaptation in low and middle income countries. My name is Andreas. I come from the independent evaluation unit at the Green Climate Fund. Just to put this in perspective, I wanted to say that given the mandate that the IEU has, so this is drawn from the objectives mentioned in the TOR, we are there to inform decision-making at the Green Climate Fund. We are also there to conduct periodic assessments, and we deliver those reports to the Convention of Parties. We felt that, besides the periodic evaluations, that obviously is a primary core function, it's important to also look at these lessons learned and identify and disseminate the lessons learned that we have worldwide. And for that reason, we felt it's very important to look at this very important question of climate change adaptation. That is a very new topic as well for us here. Next slide, please. What I want to leave you with is the very first slide is just going to show us a little bit on a trend. So if you look the lower graph on the right-hand side, you see the number of records in the Web of Science that contain climate change adaptation in the title or the abstract. And you can see we have definitely an upwards trend that's coming all after 2012 and really rapidly increasing to about 700 to 800 studies. And that's interesting and that's important. When you then take this into context of a rigorous theory-based impact evaluations, you will find the upper graph that shows you from FREE that we have a promising global trend, upwards global trend. And that's mostly reflected in the areas of Asia, Latin America, and East Africa, where we start to have evidence that strongly shows that's based on an array of different impact evaluations. One aspect that we need to look at here, though, is that there are geographic gaps. And in particular, fragile and conflict states are neglected in most studies. Other gaps that we found were also thematic gaps. So most of the promising evidence that stems from impact assessments is definitely in the health, education, and social and agricultural sector, less so in other sectors. And lastly, there's also a distributional gap across the different areas and themes. Next slide, please. What our evidence gap map for adaptation looked at is that question of where and what kind of high quality evidence do we have on adaptation intervention. And again, allow me to link this a little bit to the Green Climate Fund. So the question that we are answering here for us personally in the independent evaluation unit, as well as for the Green Climate Fund, is that of what do we know about adaptation? And that's very linked to this question of governing instruments, and this strong link to say that in the governing instrument of the GCF, it says that the GCF as the largest global climate fund would look at adaptation as well as mitigation in a very balanced manner. Coming to the PICOS, so the population intervention comparator and outcome and studies framework, and that's the usual framework that we use for evidence gap maps, we looked mostly on human-centric interventions. So our population is definitely in low and middle income countries and the different sectors, but it looks at this question of where's the human connection. In terms of intervention, we really looked at IPCC reports to also adjust this and give that link to how do we understand climate change and how do we understand climate hazards. And here interventions are to adjust, to reduce, or to stop, or to benefit from any changes due to climate. Comparators are all non-adaptation studies. Outcomes are definitely talking about the different array of outcomes in the suite and the continuum of outcomes you can think about. I'll show you a graph on this later. And studies, we focused mostly on very strong studies that are experimental, quasi-experimental, or non-experimental, but still strong in the study design, as well as systematic reviews. Next slide, please. What every evidence gap map will have to go through is this question of what to include and what to exclude. So in inclusion and exclusion criteria are key. And here this map or this tree shows you a little bit our decision tree going through a database of over 13,000 documents that we cited at first, to about 464 studies that were retained through the inclusion and exclusion. Next slide, please. Exactly 464 studies were used for this evidence gap map. Next slide. And here it is. So you may have already seen this from Sven, and the introduction was very, very similar to what I would have told you. Just to maybe give you a bit of more meat to this. When you look at the left-hand side, you see the different sectors. And one may think, how did we decide on the different sectors? So that's been a very critical discussion that we've had with our partners at DEval that have produced this evidence gap map with us, is to say, okay, what are the global climate funds thinking about? What areas and how are they categorizing the different sectors? And what we came up with is the 4 sectors that you see here. The next question then we ask ourselves is, how do we look at interventions? And here we wanted to find an array of 7 interventions that would then very well link to all of these different sectors, to also be able to look across the different sectors and see for trends and evidence. And on the horizontal line, you obviously see the outcome areas. And these, as I mentioned, we looked at the IPCC assessment report from 2007, as well as 2014, to better understand what is vulnerability. How do we understand the context of adaptation in vulnerable countries, as well as the question of how is vulnerability understood. And this is what we came up with. What I want to leave you with here is, and I made these 3 cycles, is to say, once this evidence gap map is done, and you will find different areas, different gaps, absolute gaps, as well as synthesis gaps. So what we found is that there are gaps in particular in the water sector and in the built environment sectors. There's definitely gaps in a variety of different interventions in the different sectors. So we found that certain intervention types and intervention groups and categories were very weak. And we have an absolute gap when it comes to the enabling environment in the institutional systems, where this is the side of the gaps. We can also talk about the side of concentration, and you may have seen these concentration of different colors. And here you see we have a lot of evidence in agriculture. And when we look at interventions, we have strong evidence in conservation agriculture and in extension services. And when we then look at the outcomes, so to marry whatever you have on the vertical line to the horizontal line, we also found a lot of high concentration in adoption studies. Thanks. Next slide, please. The question that we ask ourselves is, how relevant is an evidence gap map for decision making? And this is something that Sven has already mentioned with the product space of the different evidence gap maps. So our invention in this space was basically to say, together with DEval, that we also wanted to look at an intervention heat map. What does that mean? An intervention heat map is basically showing you next to the evidence gap map all the budgetary items that have gone in. So all the budgetary items from larger funds. For this very study here, we limited our view only to the GCF funds, as well as to the funds of the German Development Corporation. Next, please. And what we find here is, similarly to what we found in the evidence gap maps, there are absolute gaps as well as synthesis gaps. And what we hope to achieve with this tool is that this would help policymakers to look into the space and look into operating in either evidence-rich areas or evidence-scarce environments. What does that mean? It means that the policymakers would be able to prioritize if they want to create new evidence, that means more rigorous impact evaluations, or want to look at synthesizing existing evidence, and that could be done through meta-analysis. Again, there were sectors that were stronger on this and sectors that were weaker on this. I wanted to leave you with one pause for thought. Here, it's really on some sectors that may not be traditionally deemed suitable for impact evaluation. And as you know, we've looked at an array from 2008 to 2020. So these are older studies, and we know that the types of models and technologies that we now can employ have drastically and rapidly developed, such as machine learning and big data. And so predominantly environment and build sectors or water sectors and policy sectors were rather challenging with impact assessment. And that's due to the fact of lack of counterfactual. Next slide, please. Right. And this is just to say, we hope the final thought I want to leave you with is, we hope that intervention heat maps and evidence gaps maps coupled could help systematically expand on the global evidence by facilitating this discussion about evidence-based programming and portfolio development for policymakers. Next slide, please. Right, this would be my last slide, just to come to some lessons learned and what's next. So what we've learned there's more evidence than we thought previously. We also learned that there's a drastic difference in respect to sectors, but also in respect to geography. So we found a lot of studies in the sub-Saharan African region, and very, very few studies in Latin America. And for the sectors, we found a lot of studies and a strong array of studies in agriculture, and less so for water. So what could be done next? In terms of the evidence gap map, we would argue and recommend to do far stronger in evaluating water and land-based ecosystems and provide these impact assessments. And similarly to this, we also would recommend to do far more systematic reviews of the evidence that's out there in adoption studies in agriculture, because these been the concentration areas that we found. And lastly, in terms of the intervention heat map, what we would argue for is to definitely include an intervention heat map to also look at the climate finance flows, to better understand of what policy direction one institution such as the GCF or the German Development Corporation would like to take in order to think about new evidence or synthesizing evidence that's there. I wanted to leave you with one last thought and one last comment on what we've done so far. So after we completed the evidence gap map and obviously tried to innovate through this intervention heat map, we've also successfully completed, together with our partners at DEval, a meta-analysis to really look at this question of adoption studies. And what do we learn from adoption, and how has the access to credit helped to adopt and uptake adaptation measures? And that's something that's forthcoming for this month and will be published on both of our websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. So before we go to our last panelist, I just wanted to encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A chat box. I already see 2 questions there, but please don't be shy. This session is for all of you, and we want to make the Q&A session really interesting for everybody. So just put your questions down there for the discussion later on. So Milena, over to you with a very interesting example from the European Investment Bank.
Thank you, Sven. Hello, everybody. In my presentation, I want to cover 3 points. First, I would like to say a few words to explain why we in the European Investment Bank Evaluation Division decided to do an evidence gap map, and this is our first evidence gap map. And then secondly, I will describe the content of our evidence gap map. And finally, I'll conclude with some considerations on our experience of engaging users during the process. First slide, please. So the evidence gap map of energy efficiency is part of a 2-phase project. In phase 1, we collect and map existing high-quality evidence on the effectiveness of energy efficiency interventions in an evidence gap map. And in phase 2, we will summarize the evidence in a systematic review to then answer a more specific question, assuming that we find enough evidence in an area that's of interest to the European Investment Bank. Next slide, please. So the reason we've decided on this 2-step approach is that we wanted to avoid spending a good part of a year on a systematic review to find at the end that there simply isn't enough primary evidence that we can synthesize and end up with a so-called empty systematic review, which will really just say that we don't know what works and what doesn't work, and that more research is needed. So that's why we first conducted an evidence gap map to allow us to see where there is sufficient evidence in an area of interest to our colleagues that hasn't yet been synthesized. Next slide, please. So what's our evidence gap map about? The map covers interventions that facilitate the uptake of technologies and services aimed at improving energy efficiency at the level of households, public institutions, businesses, and industry. And it specifically focuses on measures aimed at improving the energy efficiency at residential, public, and commercial buildings, but also investment in production processes, such as more energy efficient equipment or machinery in SMEs and industrial facilities. On the right side of this slide, what you can see is our intervention outcome categories, which we included in the map. So for intervention categories, we've got policy measures, then financial assistance and market enabling interventions, and also information and technical capacity as a third category. And for outcomes, we included short-term outcomes such as behavior change, socioeconomic outcomes, for example, jobs created, and then environmental outcomes such as greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And here are our PICOs. You've seen them for the other 2 gap maps already. So in terms of the inclusion criteria, as I said before, our map focuses on interventions that facilitate the uptake of energy efficient practices. It includes interventions at the level of households, public institutions, businesses, and industry. We've got no geographic restrictions. And as for the types of studies, we focused on impact evaluations that apply either an experimental or quasi-experimental design, and which have been published no later than the year 2000. Next slide, please. So we have got to the stage of having produced a draft map. This hasn't yet been published. So I won't go into a lot of detail in terms of findings here, maybe just to say, as you might be able to work out from the snapshot on the right-hand side, we've found studies which are pretty evenly distributed across the interventions that we included. We didn't find a lot of systematic reviews, and those systematic reviews that we did find were assessed as methodologically not being of high quality. So in total, we've got roughly 300 studies that we've mapped onto this map. And I'll leave it at that. I won't talk through this map in more detail. I'll move on to the next slide to concentrate a little bit more on the user engagement and our experience there. So, as I've said at the start, for us in the European Investment Bank Evaluation Division, this is the first time we're working on a systematic evidence review. And for this reason, we were especially keen to make sure that the focus of this review tallied with the need of our end users, so of our colleagues in operation and also our management. The first point of engagement we had with our reference group for this piece of work was around the identification of the topic of the evidence gap map. And there, a challenge we've encountered was that the interest was for us to look at newer intervention areas. So, for example, circular economy was an area that was put forward. And as Sven has already noted in his introduction, evidence gap maps and systematic reviews work best for more established areas where research has already taken place. Once we agreed on a topic, the second slightly tricky discussion with our reference group was around the type of evidence and the focus of this map being on effectiveness. And the reason that was a little bit tricky was because a lot of the organizational incentives remain at the input level. And then our most recent interaction with the reference group was when we presented the draft map. Here it became obvious that the map itself is a useful instrument, certainly for those of us working in evaluation, working in research, but it's less interesting to colleagues working in operations. And that's mainly because it doesn't actually tell them what the results of the studies are. So for this reason, a systematic review will be more useful for our colleagues in operations. Next slide, please. So in terms of lessons, we've learned so far that it's quite important to actually manage expectations, and that it's probably useful to also engage users more broadly around the different types of evidence. Also, we've seen that it's been quite useful to have an adaptable reference group. So initially, when we discussed the topic for the evidence gap map, we had quite a large reference group. And now that we are starting to think about the scope of our systematic review, we've got a more focused, smaller expert group of colleagues we're working with to decide on that topic. And then finally, as I've said before, so we've seen how evidence gap maps are certainly of interest to researchers and evaluators, but it's a less obvious tool to engage users, mainly because the map doesn't really tell them what the evidence says. And I'll close here. Thank you very much, and I hand back to Sven.
Thank you so much, Milena, for this presentation, and also thanks to Magdalena and Andreas for their excellent presentations. So, esteemed colleagues, being present virtually here, now we've got about 40 minutes for Q&A, perhaps a bit less because we want to wrap up with sort of some final thoughts. And I see that the first questions are coming into the Q&A chat box. So please don't be shy. Just put whatever you wanna ask into the chat box. That will be really interesting for all of us being present here. So the first one, we have our colleague Bishwat Pradhan, who's asking about what to do with different types of evaluation. I think this is an excellent thought. So in our evidence gap maps, we didn't really distinguish between sort of ex ante, midterm, final evaluations. There are evidence gap maps who do sort of this type of distinguishing. We in fact didn't, but in similar to what Andreas was showing in his overview, where we mapped non-experimental study, quasi-experimental and experimental studies, you could decide in your framework to see, well, I actually want to focus on sort of where can we find midterm evaluations and where do we find final evaluations. However, sort of a limitation here is that it might be a bit more hard to find those studies. I mean, many midterm evaluations aren't really published. So finding them and then showing a minimum quality level, what goes in, might be a challenge there. But Magdalena mentioned also in her presentation that sometimes if you are in specific fields, you need to look at or need to be a bit more lenient what kind of evaluations and studies you consider, because otherwise you won't find enough. Milena also pointed that out too, with respect to the circular economy. So I think this is feasible within the maps, but there are certain limitations. So let me just pass these questions to the panelists to see whether they want to add. Perhaps Magdalena, I'll start with you. Perhaps you can elaborate just a bit more what you did in that field where you didn't see so many studies. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Sven. I think one of the, it is true, even for our evidence gap map, we try to include everything that we could find, right? I mean, we still really paid attention to specific inclusion criteria in terms of rigorous evaluation methodology that needed to be in place, but it didn't matter if this was coming from a midterm evaluation or an evaluation that was done ex post, as long as it reported on the effects that we were looking for. But I think one of the issues that Sven mentioned, and also where we had difficulties, especially in the blended finance space, is this evaluation, specifically those looking at things ex ante or midterm, is this public? And this is even more extreme in the blended finance field, because there you have the problem that most of the evaluations are not public, and even those being at earlier stages are even more problematic. So I think this is really something to pay attention to, of how you can collect your evidence, and this is probably a little more difficult in this field. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So Andreas and Milena, do you want to? Milena wanted to add something as well, so let's go with you, Milena, first.
Okay, thanks, Sven. So as I said, our evidence gap map focused on impact evaluations. So most of them are conducted ex post. So I think the issue of midterm evaluations didn't come up for us so much. What did come up for us was the sort of distinguishing between published studies, which were peer-reviewed, and then the grey literature, where some of our colleagues were challenging us to why we were including the grey literature without actually marking them on the map when they may not have passed the same quality checks as those which appear in journals. And obviously we were keen to have the grey literature because it's understood that often studies with significant findings do get published, whereas those that don't have any significant findings often don't get so much attention. So we were keen to have the grey literature there. But so for us, that's a challenge, and I don't think we've quite resolved it yet, whether to actually give those maps different colors on the map, give those studies, depending on where they come from, different colors. Because as Sven said at the start, what these evidence gap maps don't do is they don't actually assess the quality of the studies themselves. They just say there is a study that we found, it follows a certain methodology, and we've put it on there. So that's one thing that we come across that we need to do a little bit more thinking about.
Thank you, Milena. Yes, excellent point. Andreas.
Yes, Sven, thanks. I almost go along the lines with what Milena has said. I agree. It's an interesting question to look at this question of assessments that happen along the way, midterm and end-term evaluations. We also looked only at ex-post evaluations mostly. But I want to make a point on the study design and the question of what studies should be included and those that shouldn't. What we found when we looked at adaptation is, of course, that some areas and some sectors had a huge array, and I mean a strong foot on some studies that we simply couldn't include because otherwise the evidence gap map would be so strong on one point and very weak on others. So I want to make this point here that, for instance, for adoption, and if you think about adoption of adaptation interventions, most of these studies are cost-benefit analysis. And those were not included in this evidence gap map. Because for the simple reason, if we would do this, we would have 1,200 studies that are, yes, they're rigorous, but they're not really looking at what we want to look at. And I think that the point is exactly there. When you think about midterm and early evaluations before the end of a program or a project, you have to ask yourself the question, is this a rigorous impact evaluation, or is it an assessment on a progress of a project or program? And for that, you know, I think we need to be a bit more careful in what we really call rigorous impact evaluations. And we've done that so in the evidence gap map here. So we really said it needs to be a quantitative, a mixed method study. That's also because of we want to be able to quantify some sort of impact and some sort of effect. We wanted to look at systematic reviews, and you know that you've seen that, and correlation studies are also fine. But for instance, also this question of forecasting modeling studies, and they are also done in some parts in adaptation. They also do not fit the same idea that we have behind the evidence gap map. And that's to say, and that's my last point on this, and that's to say, an evidence gap map will always only be as strong as the framework is. And at the end of the day, it doesn't show the variety of studies that are out there. It shows only these studies that sort of fall through the mesh of inclusion and exclusion criteria. And in that sense, every evidence gap map is very unique on its own. But yes, to respond to your question, some people may and will and have thought about including midterm as well as early evaluations in that. Thanks.
Yes, very good points as well. Thank you, Andreas. So I'm glad to see that questions are coming in. So we've got two more. The next one is in terms of what can we see during the COVID-19 pandemic, and sort of what is out there in terms of systematic reviews, and what are challenges for EGMs for cross-cutting issues. Perhaps let me just start with mentioning that a couple of days on, you get our presentations as PDFs from the organizers, as they did in the past, and there will be references and links to repositories, specifically from 3IE, where you see what kind of evidence gap maps there are, and they actually 3IE has a great website where you can also look at the which studies there are included. So if you're interested in certain sectors or topics, for instance, 3IE or Campbell collaboration, or if you're more in the field of medicine, for instance, Cochrane, they are great resources to look at, and I think that is in response to the questions. What I would recommend, first of all, look at those repositories and find out what is already out there before you start commissioning one. Second point is that some of the topics that Han-Young is mentioning here, well, this is a bit the challenge. You know, the pandemic is so recent. You need to have the studies completed first, ideally being published. So I would be very surprised if you have already something, you know, being published in terms of, for instance, social economic effects of the pandemic. So it's always retrospective, and it's always with a certain lack of time that you can look at those issues. So some of those points might be just too recent. But perhaps somebody from my esteemed colleagues want to add to this. I see Andreas nodding. So Andreas, start with you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to make a note on, and I agree absolutely. We're still waiting for strong and rigorous impact evaluations to come forward and present us with results on COVID and the impacts of COVID on the work in climate change. One, however, is that we have a synthesis study that's out there, and it's just been published today from the UN, from several UN offices on the question of COVID times and climate change. And what they found is, and that's one of the key findings, is that while there was a bit of a dip in the beginning of COVID in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we are still up to the same level, and we are still looking at severe weather events and related to climate change, and at severe problems around the globe. So from that perspective, and that's been published by UN offices, it says that COVID has had unfortunately no impact in the long run on climate change. I think I leave it at that. In terms of systematic reviews and evidence gap maps, I'm not aware of any, but I'm happy to discuss this further. Thank you.
Thanks, Andreas. I'm just looking at Milena, Magdalena. No reactions, no additions to this question. Okay, good. Oh, Milena, yes, please.
No, just to say no.
Oh. Okay, good. So the next question from Zenbo Yang is actually very, very interesting. Why, after so many years of research and evaluation, do we still have those gaps? This is almost, I think, a philosophical question. And since I'm not a philosopher, I'll pass it perhaps first of all to the panelists. But I think, I mean, there are very good reasons why we find some gaps. So perhaps in your practical experience doing those maps, where did you see those gaps? You already mentioned them, but what might be the reasons that you have some of them? I think this is something you all encountered, or we all encountered. So I would just go through Magdalena, Andreas, and Milena as you presented to reflect on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sven, and thanks a lot for this interesting question. Yes, I think for the blended finance space, actually, this question was the most severe, probably, because we were talking about a lot of potential and relevance, and about, I think, by far the lowest number of evidence and the most gaps among the three evidence gap maps we had. What we came across as potential reasons of why we have an uneven distribution of evidence here, I think are related to different aspects. I think, first of all, as I mentioned, there is still among the evaluation community quite a lot of discussion about this field of blended finance as this is not traditional bilateral financial cooperation, but this is actually including investors that are at least not typically in this field and now coming more in from the private side. So I think even the evaluation community is still working on providing standards and going ahead with evaluation methodology. We as DEval are working in a number of working groups to actually develop specific evaluation methodology for this field. So I think one of the reasons is in terms of really rigorous impact evaluation that we have quite a lot of open questions regarding the evaluation. And I think the most important in this area is really thinking about, as soon as the private sector in this case is coming in, we always have the question of why do we need or how much of public money do we need? So how concessional does the support needs to be? And this raises the question of additionality, and this makes it even more complex on how to evaluate. So we found not too many studies, actually a very low number, really dealing with the issue of financial and development additionality in this case. So I think this is also one of the reasons. And then is explained, and this comes also a bit back to the theory of change. I mean, this is always a good explanation that many theory of changes are very complex. I think this is probably true for all areas we're looking into. But I think for the blended finance space, it's often the case that we have extremely long causal change, really ranging from different type of investments going into, for example, a fund structure, going to local commercial banks or microfinance institutions, and then going to end beneficiaries that could be companies, but could also be individuals in the end. So we really have those long chains, and I think this makes maybe also the number of impact evaluations that we have in the field even lower. So I think these are maybe the major reasons I can think of in this case. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And of course, to all you listening, we already know a couple of gaps. So when you're commissioning evaluations, and if you're working in the space of financial cooperation, blended finance, but also what Milena mentioned and Andreas, take the results that represented into account and look at where we can all, as evaluation community, contribute to filling those gaps with primary studies. Andreas, in your experience, what are the reasons for the gaps?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the IEU as independent evaluation unit has used evidence gap maps for quite some time. I think we've completed 2. We have another 3 that are going on at the moment. It's interesting to see across the different topics and across the different fields. Let me say 4 things. One thing is definitely we're always at the forefront of evidence curation and learning. That means, you know, we don't tend to look at questions that can be answered easily. We look at questions that are a little bit more tricky, and for that reason, our evidence gap maps usually tend to have gaps and show gaps. And that's also, in a way, it's also the intention, because you want to know that something is upcoming, people are working in certain areas, and I think that marries very well to what Magdalena has said about blended finance. It's just very new, and you're at the forefront of this new wave of interventions and forms of intervention. The second point I want to make is, it's also that question for us in particular in respect to adaptation. Adaptation has not been at the forefront of everyone's minds before 2008. So I showed you this graph, and it was really true that, you know, there was only, in the Web of Science, there were only very few studies before 2008. And that's why we said we start with 2008 and look forward. Why is that? That's simply because climate change as such was not in the forefront of our minds as much. And therefore was also not was also not of particular interest to research. At least it was, but not to the same extent as it is now. So we also had this problem. Then we looked at adaptation and how do we differentiate between adaptation interventions and simple development interventions. And I mentioned this in this respect because in the field of climate change, that's very tricky. And that's also been a very tricky field for us for this framework, for this PICOS framework, to see what is exactly a climate change adaptation and how is it different from development. My third point is finance. Finance has only come in shortly after. So what I want to say, you know, leave you with this idea of the GCF. The GCF as the largest climate fund that looks at mitigation and adaptation has only come into effect in 2015. We currently have over 120 projects, approved projects, and the implementation of these projects is still in its earlier stage. So if you think about evaluations and rigorous impact evaluations, they only come after. And that was the point that the discussion that we've had earlier. So that will take some time. And lastly, it's publication bias, I think. It's really that question of, are these impact evaluations then really published in the space that we are looking at? And here we go again with the same discussion that we've had a little bit a couple of minutes ago, where we say, okay, if you look at this question of language, you know, GCF operates in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So you have a lot of different languages to deal with as well. And for this evaluation, for this evidence gap map, we only looked at English, and the abstract could be in a different language, but we only looked at English studies. So that's definitely also a limitation. And then publication, of course, the gray literature, as we discussed earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. I just wanted to emphasize this last point, and that's why we're so glad for the invitation to the Asian Evaluation Week, because there are so many colleagues now here being present, and I think as evaluation community, looking at studies in the Asian space, studies being published in Chinese, in Hindu, in different languages. I think this is a big gap that we weren't able to focus on, as Andreas said. The abstract could have been in a different language. Okay, there's a fifth question, but as moderator, I had one question for all of you, which I think is very interesting for the audience, which we didn't discuss through the presentations. So if you could just tell our listeners and viewers, how long does it take and how much does it cost? And is commissioning an EGM the option, or is that something that you could also recommend doing in-house? What is your experience, and what is your recommendation for evaluation managers being present here? Who wants to go first? Just unmute yourself. Who's quickest can start.
I can go first, Sven. Is that
okay?
Yeah.
Great.
So as I said, it's our first evidence gap map we are working on in the evaluation division in the EIB, and therefore we have certainly worked with an expert organization with 3IE on this map. So we commissioned a team to work with us and to teach us whilst we were going through the process. As I said, we're just coming to the sort of analysis and writing up of the report phase. I think it's taken us roughly 6 months to get to this point. don't know if I'm giving away commercial secrets by telling you how much this whole thing cost us, but in terms of buying in external people, we're talking quite a bit of money. We're actually talking almost 100,000 euros. And then obviously the team and the people within the EIB who've also contributed.
No, I don't think this is a commercial secret. I think 3IE is quite transparent that this is sort of the ballpark figure you have to take into account. But then again, 3IE, this is the gold standard, the best guys out there. There are other ways of doing this as well. And if you're not sort of organization of the size of the EIB, even though we all face our budgetary restrictions, which are quite similar actually. So Magdalena.
Yes, thanks a lot. I think for us and how we dealt with the evidence gap map on blended finance, it was actually quite interesting process, because we decided that for such a specific field as we have in blended finance, with not many people working on this, we decided to actually differentiate between the development of the framework, which was done with one consultant and expert in the field of blended finance to really come up with a theory of change and inclusion and exclusion criteria, but also with quite a lot of support from our team from side of DEval. So this was actually, and this was mentioned in a lot of presentations, that quite a lot of effort should go into this framework. And for this, we decided that the search protocol and process for the actual EGM should be extra. And these steps, apart from the framework, actually were done with also a consultancy firm, in our case, AA, and they were also focusing then on defining the search protocol, testing it, and then coming up with the actual evidence gap map. And then we as a team put everything into a short paper, actually discussing it and then comparing with the actual financial flows. The same as Andreas was also mentioning, also in our case, it was a little less effort due to the evidence gaps. But this is then something we did as a team. So as you can see, we had quite a bit of back and forth between different experts involved, and things we did ourselves, and we found that that was a very good process and not taking too much time and not having to spend too much resources from our own teams. So in terms of timing, I think, but you saw that there was not so much evidence. I think we were talking about more or less 4 months. So it was rather quick, but this has a lot to do also with how much evidence you are coming up. And in the end, we had a team of around 5 to 6 people working on this. Not full time, but from time to time. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas.
I'm trying to get my head around this, but yeah, thanks for the question. Commissioning or not, from the IU's perspective, and as said, you know, one of the objectives is to disseminate and identify the lessons learned globally, and then help to provide them for the decision making internally. So we felt it was necessary to have that expert opinion. So we commissioned all of them. And the earlier evidence gap map in forestry and conservation efforts that was done together with C4, so the Center for International Forestry Research. And we feel that is still the best way forward, to really look into a potential team that helps to also go through the technical aspects. And sometimes you just, you know, we're all evaluators and we're all very smart, but at some point it's really good to have somebody that has that technical expertise and can help with that. And for that reason, we definitely had them. And then the second point why we also commissioned them is the simple, sheer, gigantic task of coding and going through the search protocol and putting that into practice. and then reviewing the different papers. And as said initially, it was 13,000. It came down to 400. Each of these steps, that inclusion, exclusion criteria steps that I showed, each of these steps required a lot of labor. And for that reason, we also felt it was best always to commission these out. And then, yeah, the only aspect, and it's true with the question of financial flows, and obviously since this was a co-produced work between DEval and IU, we had to look at the different internal data sets as well. So that required a lot of work from our own data people. And that's to say that that's where I think where our bulk of work was done internally as well. And then in addition to this, there's a review process that has to go, and there we usually engage, similarly to what Milena said, a reference group or an advisory group that would help us to look at this. So that is the group, the bigger structure of how to go about it. In terms of timing, we've seen anything from 6 months to roughly 15 months. So it can be anything from half a year to a bit over a year. That really depends on the size of the evidence gap map, and that's sometimes hard to project. And so in terms of money, I would agree with my other colleagues and the speakers before me. It can be anything from 50,000 up to 100,000 US dollars. That's sort of the experience that we've had so far. It can obviously be much more expensive. We have colleagues from FreeIE that told us that this is still not adequate in terms of funding. Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Andreas. And then there's a last question before I'm going to wrap up the question, which I think is directed to you, Andreas, because you started talking about this point, how useful evidence gap maps are for countries where there's limited evidence published. So perhaps just 30 seconds for our colleague in a space where there's little evidence published. I think it sort of depends on what kind of topic you wanna investigate. Okay, Andreas.
You want to say a few words? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to say an example, a good example is what we're doing currently. We're doing an evaluation on the effectiveness of investments in the climate investments in the SIDS, so the small island developing states. And what we found there is scarcity of data is a big story and a big problem. And knowing how to go and how to move forward is always a big problem. So yes, the evidence gap maps usually help to then get an idea of what's possible and what has been done in other areas in other countries and what has been found to be working, at least working in terms of the pairs between sectorial and intervention type to outcome. And that has helped to navigate sometimes with some of the counterparts that we've had. Other than that, I'd say it really depends the sector then to delve deeper into this question. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, esteemed colleagues, thanks for your attention today on our session on evidence gap maps. Very glad to see 59 participants here, so that's great to get so much interest from all of you. Just to wrap up this session, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers from the Asian Evaluation Week for this session, for having us here, and for the excellent organization. So Connie and Ange, big thumbs up to you. That was great. Rarely seen such a professionally organized webinar or virtual event, and we had quite some in the recent months. So thanks for that. Then I just wanted to highlight again. So I think you saw us 4 colleagues here sitting and presenting evidence gap map really as a useful tool for us as evaluators. It's a tool that requires some effort. It requires some time and resources. But I think we all believe that this is in the end the most cost-effective way, because if you think of commissioning just one quasi-experimental or experimental study or big evaluation, that costs way more than an evidence gap map. And if you do that in a space where you have already lots of evidence, it's money wasted. So it is money, but it's a strategically good investment to do this. As you've seen, so we can just encourage you to look at some sectors or topics like blended finance, lots of activities, interventions going on there. You may want to look at commissioning evaluations there. The water sector as well. On the other hand, look at agriculture, for instance, and there's space for systematic reviews or review of reviews even. So you'll get our maps and they'll be published. So hopefully they're useful for you to decide where you want to focus on. I think also the idea of a heat map to understand the financial flows, it's a cool one. And also for all of us, Milena's point on the user engagement within our own institutions and with broader stakeholders, it's definitely a key one. You need to manage those expectations time and time again. Evidence gap maps are sort of misunderstood. So with that, I'll leave it to all of you. Many thanks for attending, and have a good rest of the day, and goodbye from us. Thank you so much.